Hello, my name is Reverend Dr. May Elise Cannon. Today is Tuesday. It's May 6th, 2025, and the day is day 578 since October 7th of 2023. I'm not going to lie. Today, doing this update has taken almost everything in me. The news from the Middle East has just made me so not only devastated, but tired, like tired to the bone. I not only want to crawl in bed and it's kind of the middle of the afternoon. I want to crawl under it and hide from the barrage of bad news that keeps coming each and every day. I started this morning early. I think I had an 8 o'clock meeting or something, and I was talking to a world-renowned rabbi. I know him, I respect him, and the summary of his message was, May, I don't have good news. You know, he wasn't speaking just about the current realities on the ground in Gaza and Israel. He was speaking about the climate for things to change. And we discussed how those in power are unwilling to compromise. Power anywhere, power in the US, Israel, power from Hamas. And he said, or kind of what we concluded in our conversation, and I think that this is so true. We've been saying this since the Biden administration got involved, early on in October 2023. The only way that things will change is if the US intervenes in a constructive way. So there's a lot of work to be done. And that was part of the conclusion we came to. God have mercy, Christ have mercy, for the sake of the children of Gaza, for the sake of those hostages that still remain, for the sake of Palestinians in Gaza, for the sake of those who are languishing in prison without charges and unjustly, for the sake of all in the Holy Land, Israelis, Palestinians, Jordanians, Egyptians, Lebanese, Syrians. Lord have mercy, Christ have mercy. An update of the news from the past 24 hours or so. Yesterday, Israel bombed the western Yemeni port city of Hudaydah. I don't listen to the news, actually. I read it most of the time, so I'm sorry I pronounce these things incorrectly all the time. But this was after Houthi rebels fired a ballistic missile at the airport in Tel Aviv over the weekend. According to the health ministry, the strikes killed at least one person and injured more than 30. This is the Israeli bombing of the port in Yemen. One person was killed, 30 injured. And then this morning, I got an alert on my phone about how the Israelis gave warning for the first time before they bombed the Yemeni airport, launching a bombing campaign. The Israeli military carried out an airstrike on Sana'a today on Tuesday. This is the second attack in 2 days on the Iran-aligned Houthi rebels after a surge in tensions between the group and Israel. Today, 3 people were killed. And if you're just catching up on what's happening in Yemen, just a quick summary. So today, the airport was bombed. Israel bombed Yemen's airport, which is Houthi-controlled. The Israelis warned people to leave the area around the airport. Yesterday, Israel struck the Hodeidah port. That was Monday. And then on Sunday, Houthi missiles were fired at Israel, and one of them landed near Israel's main air hub. That was on Sunday. In terms of Syria, I don't have a lot of geopolitical news, but I saw an article I wanted to call your attention to. It's about Syrian Jews holding their first group prayer in decades in Damascus. This was in a Damascus synagogue. The community that is Jewish left in Syria is tiny. They held their first group prayer in decades on Wednesday. I was last week, I believe. This is in a synagogue in Damascus's old city, expressing joy at the long-awaited return to public worship. This is in the Faranj synagogue. The Syrian-American rabbi, Yusuf Hamra, led the prayer for the first time since arriving. He went to Syria from the U.S. He's lived in the U.S. since the 90s. He said, the last time I visited the synagogue here and prayed was before I traveled to America in the 1990s. Hamra is 77 years old. After arriving in Damascus 2 days ago, I came to pray for the first time after 34 years. He told the press, this is in the Jewish quarter of the capital of the old city of Damascus. Hamra said he was the last rabbi to quit Syria, one of thousands of members of the Jewish community that left in the 90s. There are now just 7 elderly Jews who are believed to live in Damascus. This was after the Islamist-led rebel alliance, the al-Shara regime, overthrew Hafez's son Bashar al-Assad in December when Assad was ousted. And so this provided an opportunity for this rabbi to return home. All of Syria's synagogues closed when civil war erupted in 2011. Hummer said, "I need Jews with me in the neighborhood," he said of the Jewish quarter, and he expressed hope that Jews will return to their neighborhood and their people in Syria. "For nearly 40 years, I haven't prayed with others, and the feeling is indescribable." I thought that was a small note of encouragement. The right of return, a privilege and an incredible right. In the West Bank, Israeli bulldozers yesterday demolished most of a Bedouin village in the Israeli-occupied West Bank. This was according to Basel Adra, a filmmaker, journalist, and activist from the area. Kogat, the Israeli coordinating body overseeing the administrative affairs, said that it demolished the buildings because they were built illegally. You should look at the statistics of how nearly impossible the vast majority of permits that are requested are all denied in the West Bank. And so most expansion is built without a permit because it's impossible to get one. Harper's Magazine published this piece, and I'm going to read just a few segments of it by Ben Ehrenreich, called "The Letter from the West Bank." And the title of it is "After Nonviolence, the End of Peaceful Resistance in Palestine." It was harrowing in its descriptiveness. It is so beautifully written. You can look up Harper's Magazine, "The Letter from the West Bank, After Nonviolence." Ehrenreich starts his letter from the West Bank, and he says, "6 years had passed since I was last in the West Bank. 10 years since I lived there. A lot has changed in my absence. Elsewhere, the months rolled by. But whenever I returned or checked in with my friends, Palestine seemed stuck in a rut. Years of passivity and despair, followed by giddy weeks of chaos in which it felt like everything might change, until despair settled in over everything again. The repetition was hard to bear. People I had come to care about gradually disappeared. Those who could left, others died or went to prison or suffered some slow internal death, invisible to those who didn't know them. Their absences haunt this story, but they also add up to a different kind of absence, the missing voices of people who have devoted their lives at great cost to speaking out and who now find themselves too afraid to speak." He goes on and tells the story about the West Bank. His words are so descriptive, but then he begins to tell the history of nonviolence. He says some version of what has come to be called nonviolent resistance dates back more than a century, but the distinction between armed and unarmed struggle became increasingly significant, to Westerners at least. As Israel positioned itself as an ally of the U.S. war on terror, the idea is simple: to stand together, to refuse the fate chosen by you or your oppressor, and with your courage to inspire others to do the same. That was the basis for the mass mobilization during the uprising of the 1936, throughout the first Intifada in the late 80s and the early 90s, and in the early weeks of the next one in the fall of 2000. As the second Intifada dragged on into its third year and the losses piled up, nonviolent tactics regained their appeal. And then he goes on and he tells the story about this village in the occupied West Bank. It's a village we know well. We work there. We know many of the community members. It's the village of Palestinians, Bedouins. It's called El Khair. El Khair is in the South Hebron Hills. And this Harper Bazaar, this Harper Magazine article continues. In the days after October 7th, the Israeli government had mobilized what it called regional defense units. These were composed of settler reservists. The line between settlers and state, always fuzzy, disappeared. Within weeks, a group of local settlers showed up in El Khair wearing IDF uniforms. They rounded up the men of the village. They threatened them at gunpoint. Other uniformed soldiers, Israelis, settlers, and police officers continued to visit El Khair, stopping cars, harassing residents, searching houses. Settlers, shepherds, sometimes disguised in masks, grazed their flocks in the center of the village. And last February, soldiers ransacked Eid's home. On finding his life savings in cash, turned him over to the police under suspicion of selling guns or drugs. And after a barrage of phone calls from Israeli allies, NGOs he'd worked with, and even the American embassy, a few hours later, he was released. That June, the bulldozers arrived, and soldiers gave Eid 30 minutes to empty his house. After the demolition, only one jagged piece of wall was left standing. It had been the corner of his daughter's bedroom. You could still see the little flowers the girl had painted on the wall, turquoise, purple, and pink. Ultimately, his house was one of 11 buildings that the soldiers destroyed. Since then, he and his family have been living in an uninsulated, windowless shed that his brother had been using to store barley. To stop on Eid's tour was his father's grave. I had known Haj Suleiman al-Hathalin as a tiny man with fiery eyes and a tremendous strength. He had not hesitated to stand up to armed soldiers and politicians, and he traveled the length of the West Bank to show up for communities. He had been, in a way, that what did not become clear until his death, the soul of resistance in al-Khair. Ultimately, Haj Suleiman al-Hathalin was killed by an Israeli settler, and Eid is the son of al-Hathalin, Haj al-Hathalin. And you can read about my history with al-Khair and with Haj al-Hathalin over the years. His picture stands, it's above my desk. There's a picture of us together in my office. But you can read about that in a blog I wrote for the Christian Reformed Church. It's a Do Justice blog, and we'll be sure to share the link. I wanted to end with Gaza. More news about Israel's plans that were approved by the May 4th cabinet meeting. Israel's security cabinet met, approved the military operation to occupy and destroy Hamas. According to reports, its official decisions have not yet been released. They might be soon. The offensive is timed to launch after President Trump returns from his Middle East trip, which is a few weeks from now, timing that corresponds to when the reservist deployments will be ready. The offensive is planned to work in stages, north to south in Gaza, very much like the first offensive did in October of 2023. It will then follow the pattern that a Washington Post article maps out. It's intended to take months, maybe even several months. And the IDF Chief of Staff Zamir reportedly told the security cabinet that the offensive could mean losing the living hostages. He said something similar in a public speech earlier on Sunday when he was visiting a military unit, and the end result of the offensive is intended to have Israel occupying all of Gaza, which has not been done since October 7th, on a more or less permanent basis. According to the public remarks by Defense Minister Katz, parts of Gaza will be annexed by Israel, and the areas to be annexed will grow if the offensive takes longer before Hamas surrenders or is eliminated. We've heard vestiges of this strategy before, but it's now back on the table, annexation of parts of Gaza. So Israel is on the eve of what's being called a forceful entry into Gaza. Netanyahu declared this yesterday in response to the security cabinet's approval of the new plans for the expansion of the military campaign in the territory. Netanyahu's opponents criticized and said that it would endanger the living hostages, and yet it is set to move forward. BBC News reported there's no point in further talks on a new Gaza ceasefire and hostage release deal in light of Israel's expanded offensive plans. The official comments seemed counter to sentiments expressed by an Israeli official yesterday who said this is a window of opportunity for the hostage deal during President Trump's visit to the region next week. The U.S. has said they will help the people of Gaza get some food. Trump said that during a news conference yesterday. Trump blamed the conditions in Gaza on Hamas, claiming that they are taking everything that's brought in. It makes you wonder, does he know things are not being brought in? The U.S. Has said they will help, and yet we've not seen that as of yet. The UN Secretary General Guterres is alarmed by reports of Israel's plans to expand the military operation in Gaza. That was said by the spokesperson yesterday. And Sean Carroll from an incredible organization called ANERA, he wrote an op-ed in the New York Times that should not be ignored. It's called "This is a Moment of Moral Reckoning in Gaza." A full-blown humanitarian emergency in Gaza is no longer looming. It is here. It is catastrophic. It's been more than 2 months since Israel cut off all humanitarian aid and commercial supplies into Gaza. The World Food Program delivered its last stores of food on April 25th. 2 million Palestinians in Gaza, nearly half of them children, are now surviving on one meal every 2 to 3 days. It was one meal a day. It's now one meal every 2 to 3 days. At makeshift clinics run by my relief agency, the American Near East Refugee Aid, ANERA, signs of prolonged starvation are becoming more frequent and alarming. In the past 10 days, our lab techs began detecting ketones an indicator of starvation in 1/3 of the urine samples tested. This is the first time we've seen such cases in significant numbers since we began testing October a year ago. Food, fuel, and medicine are exhausted or close to it. Every hour is a race against time, but without the access and political will needed to deliver aid and save lives and end the unimaginable suffering, our hands are tied. This is the longest continuing total siege on Gaza that it's endured since the war and since before. Israel is now openly exploiting aid as a tool of war. Senior officials have declared what effectively is the intent to use starvation as a tactic to pressure Hamas to release the remaining hostages, a clear violation of international law. Many Palestinians fear it is a part of a plan to expel them from Gaza, and aid groups warn that Palestinians could end up in de facto internment conditions. Israel's blockade and the deliberate delays, denials, and excessive security procedures that surround it are not just a failure of logistics. It is an engineered system of deprivation. The short-lived ceasefire in January provided inadequate to meet the humanitarian needs. Aid increased beginning on January 19th. It was cut off entirely by March. The intent to use hunger as leverage is explicit, and it's unconscionable. Carol goes on to talk about the world's leaders and how their words remain no more than just that. Words, empty and ignored. And this is what he says. Sean Carroll Anera says this, and we at Churches for Middle East Peace agree. Israel must be required to create open and secure humanitarian corridors. Without them, it is impossible to scale up the relief because every delivery is a gamble with civilian and aid workers' lives. And while an immediate ceasefire and influx of aid are urgently needed, they will not be enough. There must be a plan, not just for relief, but recovery, which cannot happen in a war zone or under a permanent siege. True recovery requires a political agreement that guarantees Palestinian presence, security, and self-determination. Humanitarian access is not just a moral imperative, it's a prerequisite for any hope of a better future. Imagine instead a Gaza where homes are built, clean water flows, children return to schools, families can once again harvest food from their own land. This vision may seem distant after decades of Israeli military occupation, blockade, and repeated wars that have severely damaged infrastructure and essential services. But we, being Anera, have improved the lives of Palestinians in Gaza before, and we can do it again. What stands in the way is not capacity, it's deliberate policy that is blocking the path to basic human dignity. He closes with this: when we talk about peace, we must ask, what kind of future are we envisioning if an entire people is left to suffer starvation? Israelis will not be safer while Gaza remains under siege. Sustainable peace is built not through domination, but through dignity, freedom, opportunity, and mutual security. This is the moment of moral reckoning. Will the world be complicit in Gaza's collapse or a part of its recovery? Lord God, may we respond to these words, inspired by your love, your wisdom, your grace, to this moment of moral reckoning. Help us to not be complicit, but people who are willing to be courageous, tireless, to risk and sacrifice for the sake of others. In the name of Christ, amen.